Picture this. It's 35,000 years before Christ, and the world is locked in a grip of ice that makes our worst winter storms look like a gentle spring breeze. Somewhere in what we might now call Eastern Europe, a hunter named Grok is stumbling through a blizzard that has already claimed the lives of 2 of his hunting companions. The wind is howling with the fury of 10,000 demons, and the snow is coming down so thick that Grok can barely see his own hands extended in front of his face. Now, you have to understand something about life 35,000 years ago. There were no weather forecasts, no emergency shelters, no rescue helicopters. When nature decided to flex her muscles, human beings either adapted quickly or they died. It was that simple. And Grok, like every other human being alive at that time, was walking a razor's edge between survival and becoming just another set of bones that future archaeologists might stumble across millennia later. But here's where our story gets interesting, because Grok was about to stumble onto something that would change the course of human civilization forever. Not intentionally, mind you. He wasn't some ancient Einstein working out the principles of thermal dynamics in his head. He was a desperate man looking for shelter, any shelter, before the storm claimed his life too. As he pushed through the driving snow, half blind and nearly frozen, Grok spotted what appeared to be a dark opening in a rocky hillside. A cave. Now, any cave in a storm is better than no cave. But as Grok stumbled inside, shaking off the snow and trying to get his bearings, he noticed something peculiar. The cave was warm, not just protected from the wind warm, but genuinely, mysteriously warm. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who has spent his entire life outdoors, who knows the difference between every type of shelter nature can provide. He's slept under rocky overhangs, in hollow trees, behind wind barriers made of brush and stone. He knows cold. But this cave was different. The walls themselves seemed to radiate warmth like some kind of ancient central heating system. Now, Grok wasn't a scientist in any modern sense, but he had something perhaps even more valuable: the curious mind of a survivor. While a lesser man might have simply been grateful for the warmth and left it at that, Grok began to notice details. Certain stones in the cave wall, these dense, dark rocks that we might recognize today as having high thermal mass. These stones were actually warm to the touch, even though the sun had set hours ago. During the 3 days that the storm raged outside, Grok conducted what was perhaps humanity's first systematic thermal experiment. He placed different types of stones near his small fire, porous stones that he'd always used for building hearths, and these heavier, denser stones from the cave wall. What he discovered would have made any modern engineer proud. The light stones heated up quickly when placed near the fire, but they also cooled down just as quickly when moved away. The dense stones, however, took much longer to warm up, but once they did, they held that heat like cupped hands hold water. Even more remarkably, during a brief break in the storm when blazing afternoon sun penetrated deep into the cave, these same stones remained cool to the touch, while everything else baked in the heat. Now, imagine trying to explain this discovery to your tribe. Remember, this is a world without written language, without scientific terminology, without any framework for understanding concepts like thermal mass or heat capacity. When Grok returned to his people and tried to describe what he'd experienced, the tribe's shaman, Kala, a wise woman named Kala, who served as both spiritual leader and keeper of practical knowledge, Kala interpreted this discovery through the only lens available to her, the sacred. The Earth Mother has revealed her secret, Kala declared, and in a way, she wasn't wrong. What Grok had stumbled upon in that cave was indeed one of nature's fundamental principles, a secret that the Earth had been keeping since the planet first formed. Dense materials store thermal energy. They moderate temperature swings. They create comfort zones that can mean the difference between life and death. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Kala didn't just file this information away as interesting trivia. She understood immediately that this knowledge was power, the power to survive winters that killed neighboring tribes, the power to stay cool during summers that drove others to seek shelter in the deepest forests. Under her guidance, the tribe began the systematic development of what we might call the world's first thermal architecture program. Grok became the teacher, showing younger members of the tribe how to identify the right types of stones, how to test them, how to position them for maximum effect. His daughter, Nala, proved to be an especially gifted student, developing an almost supernatural ability to select stones that would perform exactly as needed. She could run her hands along a rock face and identify which stones would serve as thermal batteries for their shelters. As word of this knowledge spread to neighboring tribes through the complex networks of trade and intermarriage that connected prehistoric communities, something unprecedented began to happen. For the first time in human history, some groups possessed a technological advantage so significant that it created what we might recognize today as social stratification based on engineering knowledge. The implications were staggering. Tribes who mastered these thermal principles could survive in regions that remained uninhabitable to others. They could support larger populations because their shelters required less fuel to heat. Their children had better survival rates because the adults weren't constantly exhausted from battling the elements. Their hunters could venture farther from home because they knew they could construct effective shelter anywhere they found the right materials. Within just a few generations, Grok's accidental discovery in that warm cave had begun to reshape the human world. The knowledge that certain stones could store and release thermal energy became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated building techniques. Families began to specialize in thermal architecture, passing down ever more refined knowledge from parent to child. But as this knowledge spread, it also became closely guarded. The tribes who possessed it realized they held something more valuable than the finest spear points or the most productive hunting grounds. They held the secret to comfort itself, to the mastery of the thermal environment that had been humanity's greatest challenge since we first walked upright. And that's where our story takes a dramatic turn. Because when one group possesses high life or death knowledge and others do not, conflict becomes inevitable. The comfortable shelters that saved lives also became targets. The thermal wisdom that enabled survival also sparked the world's first technology wars. What happened next would determine whether this revolutionary knowledge would remain the closely guarded secret of a few fortunate tribes, or whether it would spread to become humanity's shared inheritance. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The very survival of our species during one of the most challenging periods in planetary history hung in the balance. 500 years have passed since Grok's discovery in that mysterious cave, and the world has become a very different place. What started as one man's accidental encounter with thermal principles has evolved into something far more complex, and frankly, far more dangerous. By 30,400 years before Christ, thermal shelter knowledge has become the most valuable secret in the prehistoric world, and like all valuable secrets, it has created winners and losers on a scale that would make modern economists weep. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like. Imagine two neighboring regions, separated by perhaps 50 miles of difficult terrain. In the fertile river valleys to the east, the river people have thrived beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. Their settlements are growing larger every generation. Their children are surviving harsh winters at rates that would seem miraculous to us today, and their hunters return from expeditions that would kill members of other tribes. Why? Because 5 centuries of accumulated thermal wisdom has given them something approaching mastery over their environment. They've learned to build shelters that maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel. They've developed techniques for creating thermal zones within larger structures. They've even begun to experiment with what we might recognize as the first primitive ventilation systems, using thermal principles to move air through their living spaces. Now, 50 miles away in the Rocky Hills, the mountain clans are watching their people die. Every winter claims a significant portion of their population. Their hunters are limited in range because they cannot survive overnight in the open. Their settlements remain small and scattered because they lack the thermal technology necessary to support larger communities. This is the world's first technological inequality, and it's based entirely on knowledge, LIs. Specifically, knowledge about how certain materials store and release thermal energy. The river people guard this information more jealously than they guard their hunting grounds or their water sources. And who can blame them? This knowledge literally means the difference between life and death. But here's where human nature enters the equation in a big way. The mountain clans aren't simply going to accept their fate and die quietly. They're going to try to level the playing field, and that means getting their hands on thermal shelter knowledge by any means necessary. What follows is a series of conflicts that we might call humanity's first technology wars. These weren't massive battles with thousands of warriors clashing on open fields. Remember, we're talking about small tribal societies where 100 people constituted a major settlement. But the raids and counter-raids, the attempts at espionage and technological theft, the blood feuds that developed over stolen thermal secrets, 19 thermal secrets. These conflicts were every bit as intense and consequential as any war in recorded history. The mountain clans tried everything. They sent hunters disguised as traders to observe river people construction techniques. They attempted to kidnap skilled thermal architects. They even launched desperate winter raids, hoping to capture intact shelters and reverse engineer their secrets. Most of these attempts failed catastrophically, often resulting in the deaths of entire raiding parties who lacked the thermal knowledge necessary to survive extended expeditions in enemy territory. But then something remarkable happened. A young woman named Asha, born to a river people family but captured as a child during one of the mountain clan raids, found herself in a unique position. Raised by her captors but still possessing fragments of inherited thermal knowledge, she began to see a solution that neither side had considered. The problem, Asha realized, wasn't just the secrecy surrounding thermal techniques. The deeper issue was that this knowledge existed only in the minds of individual practitioners. When a skilled thermal architect died, their specific insights often died with them. When conflicts scattered tribes, crucial information was lost. The knowledge was too fragmented, too personal, too vulnerable to the chaos of prehistoric life. Asha's innovation was as simple as it was revolutionary. She began encoding thermal building principles in songs and stories. Not random songs, mind you, but carefully structured musical narratives that embedded technical information in memorable, transmissible formats. She became the world's first stone singer, and her innovation would transform how human knowledge was preserved and shared. Think about the genius of this approach. In a world without written language, songs and stories were the only reliable way to preserve complex information across generations. But Asha went further than simple memorization techniques. She created narrative frameworks that made thermal principles intuitive and emotionally resonant. One of her most famous songs told the story of the Firestone Maiden, a mythical figure who could touch any rock and know whether it would serve as a thermal battery. The song contained detailed descriptions of stone density, thermal response characteristics, and optimal placement techniques, all woven into a compelling narrative about the maiden's adventures. Hunters could sing this song around evening fires, children could learn it as entertainment, and builders could use it as a technical manual. Another composition, The Ballad of the Wise Cave, encoded ventilation principles in the story of a cave that could breathe like a living creature. The song described how air moved through underground passages, how temperature differences created air currents, and how builders could harness these principles in their own structures. Again, complex technical knowledge was preserved in a format that could survive the death of any individual practitioner. As Asha's songs spread through both the river people and the mountain clans, something unprecedented began to happen. The carefully guarded thermal secrets began to democratize. Knowledge that had been restricted to elite families and specialized craftsmen became accessible to anyone with a good memory and a decent singing voice. But the real breakthrough came during what tribal historians would later call the Great Sharing. A particularly brutal ice age descended on the region, bringing winter conditions so severe that even the river people's advanced thermal shelters were barely adequate for survival. Faced with the prospect of mutual extinction, both groups realized that cooperation might serve their interests better than continued conflict. The negotiations were led by Asha, now recognized as the greatest stone singer of her generation. Her proposal was radical, a complete exchange of thermal knowledge between the two peoples, with ongoing cooperation in developing new techniques. The river people would share their accumulated wisdom, while the mountain clans would contribute their hard-won knowledge of surviving in marginal environments. The alliance worked better than anyone had dared hope. Combined thermal knowledge from both groups led to innovations that neither could have achieved alone. The river people's sophisticated understanding of thermal mass was enhanced by the mountain clan's expertise in working with limited materials and extreme conditions. New building techniques emerged that were more efficient, more adaptable, and more robust than anything either group had developed independently. More importantly, the stone singer tradition that Asher had established became the foundation for preserving and transmitting this expanded knowledge base. Schools of stone singers emerged, each specializing in different aspects of thermal architecture. Some focused on stone selection and preparation, others on structural design principles, still others on the integration of thermal and ventilation systems. By the end of this period, the landscape of human thermal knowledge had been completely transformed. What had once been a closely guarded secret possessed by a few elite families had become a shared cultural inheritance, preserved in songs and stories that could survive the collapse of individual communities or even entire civilizations. But Asher's innovation had implications that reached far beyond thermal architecture. She had demonstrated that complex technical knowledge could be democratized through careful attention to how information was structured and transmitted. Her stone singer tradition became a model for preserving all kinds of specialized knowledge, from hunting techniques to medicinal practices to astronomical observations. As human populations began to recover and expand following the Great Sharing, they carried with them not just thermal building techniques, but a revolutionary new approach to knowledge, preservation, and sharing. The songs and stories that had saved them from extinction would accompany them as they spread across continents, adapting and evolving to meet the thermal challenges of every environment, from tropical deserts to Arctic tundra. The stage was now set for thermal architecture to become humanity's first truly global technology, carried by migrating populations to every corner of the Earth, and adapted to every conceivable climate challenge our species would encounter. Now we're going to fast forward through one of the most remarkable periods in human history, the Great Migrations that took place between 20,000 and 5,000 years before Christ. This is when our species really began to flex its muscles, spreading out across every continent except Antarctica, and proving that human beings could thrive literally anywhere on Earth. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Everywhere humans went, they took with them the thermal wisdom that had been born in Grok's cave and refined through Asher's stone singer traditions. What we're witnessing is the world's first global technology transfer, and it's happening entirely through oral tradition, carried in the minds and songs of migrating peoples. But here's the beautiful part. This technology didn't just spread unchanged from culture to culture. Instead, each group that encountered new environmental challenges adapted and improved the basic thermal principles, creating innovations that would have amazed even Asher herself. Let me tell you 3 stories that illustrate just how remarkable this process was. 3 individuals, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, each building on the foundation of thermal knowledge to create solutions that were perfectly adapted to their unique environments. Our first story takes us to the Nile Valley, around 8,000 years before Christ. Here we meet Katu, a builder whose people have recently settled along the great river that would eventually become the lifeline of Egyptian civilization. Now, Katu's ancestors carried stone singer traditions with them during their migration from the north, but those songs spoke mainly of staying warm and dealing with cold winters. The Nile Valley presented an entirely different challenge. How do you stay cool when the sun beats down mercilessly for months at a time? Katu was experimenting with mud brick construction, XIT, itself an innovation that built on thermal mass principles, when he made a discovery that would revolutionize architecture in hot climates. He noticed that identical mud bricks, oriented in different directions, created dramatically different thermal effects. Bricks aligned to catch the morning sun would heat up and radiate warmth throughout the day, while bricks positioned to remain in shadow stayed surprisingly cool. But Katu went further than simple observation. He began systematically testing different orientations, different wall thicknesses, different arrangements of openings and passages. What he developed was the prototype for what we now call passive solar design, buildings that use the sun's energy when it's needed and exclude it when it's not. His greatest innovation was the courtyard house, a design that captured cool night air in a central space surrounded by thermal mass walls. During the brutal heat of the day, these walls would absorb the courtyard's coolness and gradually release it into the living spaces. At night, the walls would radiate accumulated heat into the open courtyard, where it could dissipate harmlessly into the sky, while the thermal mass recharged with cool air for the next day's cycle. Think about the sophistication of this system. Katu had essentially created a natural air conditioning system, using nothing but mud bricks, careful orientation, and a deep understanding of how thermal mass behaves in different conditions. His courtyard houses could maintain comfortable temperatures even during the season when the Nile Valley became one of the hottest places on Earth. Now, let's jump thousands of miles to the east and forward several millennia to meet our second innovator. Lin lived along the Yellow River, in what we now call China, around 6,000 years before Christ. Her people had developed sophisticated pottery techniques and were beginning to experiment with more permanent settlements, but they faced a unique thermal challenge that Katu never had to deal with. How do you create thermal comfort in a climate that swings from brutally cold winters to sweltering summers? Lin's breakthrough came when she was helping to repair a shelter that had been damaged by flooding. The shelter had been built in the traditional style, directly on the ground, but the flood had washed away much of the foundation. As they worked to rebuild, Lin suggested something that must have seemed crazy at the time. What if they raised the entire structure off the ground and used stones to create a thermal buffer between the building and the earth? Her reasoning was brilliant. During winter, the stone foundation would absorb heat from cooking fires and radiate it upward into the living space, while also preventing the building from losing heat directly to the cold ground. During summer, the raised foundation would allow cooling air to circulate underneath the structure, while the thermal mass of the stones would absorb excess heat and release it harmlessly into the ground. Lin's raised floor design with stone thermal foundations became the standard for construction throughout the Yellow River region. But she didn't stop there. She also developed techniques for varying the thickness and composition of walls based on their orientation and function, creating buildings that responded dynamically to seasonal changes in solar angle and prevailing wind patterns. What's remarkable is that Lin was working entirely within the stone singer tradition that had originated with Asha, but she was adapting those principles to solve problems that Asha could never have imagined. The songs and stories that preserved thermal knowledge were flexible enough to accommodate radical innovations while maintaining the core principles that made them effective. Our third story takes us to Central America, around 5,000 years before Christ, where we meet Itzel, whose people were developing what would eventually become some of the most sophisticated thermal architecture in the pre-Columbian world. Itzel lived in a highland environment where temperatures could vary dramatically between day and night, and where the angle of the sun changed significantly throughout the year. Itzel's innovation focused on what we might call thermal wall optimization. Working with adobe, essentially an advanced form of the mud brick that Katu had pioneered, she discovered that the thickness of thermal mass walls needed to be precisely calibrated to the specific thermal cycles of their resample environment. Through patient experimentation, she determined that walls of different thicknesses responded to thermal input at different rates. Thin walls would heat up and cool down quickly, making them ideal for spaces that needed rapid temperature adjustment. Medium-thickness walls provided steady thermal buffering for main living areas. Thick walls acted as long-term thermal batteries, storing heat from sunny days and releasing it slowly over several nights. But Itzel's masterstroke was her development of what we might call thermal zoning within individual buildings. She created structures with different wall thicknesses in different areas, allowing families to move between zones as their thermal comfort needs changed throughout the day and across seasons. During cold periods, they could gather in areas with thick thermal mass walls that provided steady warmth. During hot periods, they could retreat to areas with thinner walls that shed heat quickly as temperatures dropped. This adaptive approach to thermal architecture represented a quantum leap in sophistication. Itzel had essentially created buildings that functioned as complex thermal machines, with different components optimized for different thermal functions. Now, here's what makes these three stories truly remarkable. Each of these innovations spread far beyond their points of origin. Katu's courtyard designs traveled along trade routes throughout North Africa and the Middle East. Lin's raised floor techniques became standard throughout East Asia. Itzel's thermal zoning principles influenced Pueblo construction throughout the Americas. But they didn't just spread as fixed technologies. Instead, they became part of the expanding repertoire of the stone singer tradition, encoded in new songs and stories that preserved not just the specific techniques, but the underlying principles that made adaptation to new environments possible. By 5,000 years before Christ, thermal architecture had become humanity's first truly global technology. Every major human settlement on Earth incorporated sophisticated thermal design principles. Desert peoples had mastered the art of staying cool. Arctic communities had perfected techniques for staying warm. Temperate zone builders had developed systems that could handle dramatic seasonal variations. More importantly, the knowledge base had become self-improving. Each new environmental challenge led to innovations that enhanced the overall understanding of thermal principles. Each successful adaptation became part of the collective wisdom that could be applied to future challenges. The permanent, comfortable settlements that this thermal mastery enabled had profound implications for human development. Stable thermal environments allowed for larger population concentrations, which in turn enabled specialization of labor, development of crafts, and the emergence of what we would recognize as the first true cities. Thermal comfort had become the foundation for civilization itself, and all of it could be traced back to that moment 30,000 years earlier, when a desperate hunter named Grok stumbled into a mysteriously warm cave and had the curiosity to ask why. And now we come to the most remarkable part of our story, I, how the thermal wisdom that began with Grok's accidental discovery in that cave 35,000 years ago has woven itself through every great civilization in human history, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the development of written language, the Industrial Revolution, and even our modern age of artificial climate control. Because here's the thing that will absolutely blow your mind. When you strip away all the fancy terminology and high-tech materials, the thermal principles that govern our most advanced buildings today are fundamentally identical to what Grok observed in that cave all those millennia ago. Dense materials store thermal energy. Thermal mass moderates temperature swings. Proper orientation and ventilation can create comfort without consuming external energy. Let me walk you through some examples that will make this connection crystal clear, starting with one of the most sophisticated thermal systems ever developed by an ancient civilization. Picture Rome at the height of its power, around 100 years after Christ. The empire stretches from Britain to Egypt, encompassing climates and thermal challenges that would have made Katu, Lin, and Itzel nod in recognition. Roman engineers, inheriting thermal wisdom that had been accumulating for over 30 millennia, had perfected something called the hypercaust system, ISHA. And if you've never heard of this, prepare to be amazed. The hypercaust was essentially a sophisticated version of Grok's cave floor heating. Roman engineers would construct raised floors supported by pillars, creating spaces underneath where heated air could circulate. Furnaces outside the building would warm air that flowed through these underfloor channels, heating the thermal mass of the stone floors, which would then radiate warmth into the rooms above. But the Romans didn't stop there. They also created hollow spaces within walls where the heated air could rise, warming the thermal mass of the wall materials before venting to the outside. The result was buildings that maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the bitter European winters, using thermal mass principles that Grok would have recognized immediately. Now let's jump forward in time, and eastward in space to Persia, around 800 years after Christ. Persian architects, working in one of the world's most challenging thermal environments, had developed what they called wind-catcher towers, ACE, structures that would look perfectly at home in a modern passive cooling textbook. These towers worked by capturing cool night air in thermal mass chambers, storing that coolness throughout the hot day, and then using thermal dynamics to create air circulation that naturally cooled interior spaces. The towers functioned as ancient air conditioners, using nothing but thermal mass, careful orientation, and an understanding of how air moves in response to temperature differences. The sophistication of these systems was extraordinary. Persian architects had calculated optimal tower heights, chamber volumes, and air passage dimensions to maximize cooling efficiency. They had developed maintenance procedures to keep the systems operating at peak performance. They had even created hybrid systems that combined thermal mass cooling with evaporative cooling using water features. But perhaps most remarkably, they had encoded all of this knowledge in architectural traditions that could survive political upheavals, economic collapses, and cultural changes. Persian thermal architecture techniques spread throughout the Islamic world, influencing building design from Spain to India, and creating a technological legacy that lasted for centuries. Moving forward to medieval Europe, we find another fascinating chapter in our thermal story. Monastery builders, working with limited resources but possessed of remarkable engineering ingenuity, had rediscovered and refined many of the thermal principles that earlier civilizations had developed. Medieval monasteries were thermal marvels, designed to house large communities in comfort while minimizing fuel consumption. The builders oriented their structures to capture maximum winter sun on thick stone walls that would store solar energy throughout the day and release it slowly through cold nights. They created sophisticated ventilation systems that used thermal dynamics to maintain air quality without sacrificing thermal comfort. They even developed early versions of thermal zoning, with different areas of the monastery optimized for different thermal functions. What's particularly fascinating is that these medieval builders were working largely without written technical manuals. Much of their thermal knowledge was preserved in guild traditions and craft practices that traced their lineage directly back to the stone singer traditions that Usher had established thousands of years earlier. Now, here's where our story takes a dramatic turn toward the modern era. The development of cheap fossil fuels in the 19th and 20th centuries led to what we might call humanity's thermal amnesia. Why worry about thermal mass and passive solar design when you could simply burn coal or oil to maintain any temperature you wanted? Why preserve ancient wisdom about building orientation when you could install mechanical heating and cooling systems? For roughly 150 years, most of the world abandoned the thermal principles that had guided human architecture for 35,000 years. Buildings became thermal disasters, ITA, all glass and steel with no thermal mass, randomly oriented with no consideration for solar angles, utterly dependent on mechanical systems for basic comfort. But then something remarkable happened. In 1967, a French engineer named Félix Trombay invented what became known as the Trombay wall, a passive solar heating system that uses thermal mass to store solar energy during the day and release it at night. The technical media hailed it as a revolutionary breakthrough in sustainable building design. Except, of course, that Félix Trombay hadn't invented anything. He had simply rediscovered principles that Grok had observed in that cave 35,000 years earlier, principles that Catu had applied to his courtyard houses, that Roman engineers had perfected in their hypercaust systems, that Persian architects had used in their windcatcher towers. The Trombay wall works by placing a thermal mass wall behind a glazed south-facing surface. Solar energy passes through the glazing, heats the thermal mass, and is then slowly released into interior spaces as the wall cools. It's a direct descendant of every thermal mass heating system that humans have ever developed, using identical principles but wrapped in modern materials and contemporary terminology. Today's passive house movement represents another rediscovery of ancient wisdom. Passive houses are designed to maintain comfortable temperatures year-round, with minimal external energy input, using superinsulation, thermal mass, careful orientation, and sophisticated ventilation systems. The technical principles are cutting-edge, but the underlying concepts would be instantly familiar to any of the thermal innovators we've met in our story. The most poetic example of this ancient-modern connection might be the work of Francis Kéré, a contemporary architect from Burkina Faso, who has won international acclaim for school buildings that stay cool without electricity in one of the hottest climates on Earth. Caveman's designs use thermal mass walls, courtyard cooling systems, and wind-catcher ventilation techniques that trace their lineage directly back through Persian architecture, Roman engineering, and ultimately to the thermal wisdom that first emerged from Grok's cave. When Caveman won the Pritzker Prize, architecture's highest honor, in 2022, the citation praised his innovative use of traditional building techniques and contemporary design approaches. But what they were really recognizing was the continuation of humanity's oldest technological tradition, a chain of thermal wisdom that has remained unbroken for 35,000 years. Because that's ultimately what our story has been about, not just the technical evolution of thermal architecture, but the remarkable continuity of human wisdom across time. In a world where most technologies become obsolete within decades, thermal mass principles remain as relevant today as they were when Grok first observed them in that mysterious cave. As we face contemporary challenges like climate change and energy scarcity, we're increasingly turning back to these ancient solutions. The most advanced sustainable buildings of the 21st century use thermal strategies that would be immediately recognizable to builders from the ancient world. The difference is that now we understand the science behind these techniques, we can model their performance with sophisticated computer simulations, and we can optimize them using modern materials and manufacturing techniques. But the fundamental insight remains unchanged. The key to thermal comfort lies not in fighting nature, but in working with natural thermal processes. Dense materials store energy, thermal mass moderates temperature swings. Proper orientation and ventilation can create comfort without consuming external energy. Grok's 35,000-year-old discovery remains humanity's most enduring technological innovation, proving that true wisdom transcends time, culture, and technological change. In our age of artificial intelligence and space exploration, the simple observation that certain stones hold heat longer than others continues to guide how we create comfortable, sustainable buildings. The thread that connects Grok's survival in that cave to Francis Caveman's award-winning schools, that links Asher's stone singer traditions to today's passive house movement, that ties Roman hypercausts to modern trombe walls. Tupa, that thread is more than just technological continuity. It's proof that human wisdom, once discovered, can survive anything history throws at it, waiting patiently to be rediscovered by each new generation that needs it. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of this entire story, that in our relentless pursuit of the new and the innovative, we keep circling back to principles that a curious hunter discovered by accident in a cave 35,000 years ago. Some truths, it seems, are simply too fundamental to improve upon,